Welcome back, Focus Learners. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through today's explainer. We are unpacking a sprawling, multi-layered interview with author and journalist Batya Ungar-Sargon. We're going to take a deep dive into shifting political allegiances, the historical identity of Jewish Americans, and the kind of hidden mechanics of our modern media landscape. If you've ever wondered how foreign policy, internet algorithms, and domestic economics all collide at the ballot box, well, this explainer is going to connect those dots for you.
Okay, let's just lay out a quick roadmap so we know where we're headed. We've organized this conversation into 5 logical themes: Jews, America, and the left, followed by mainstreaming versus policing extremism. Then we'll cover the influencer, audience capture, foreign policy versus domestic reality, and finally wrap up with midterms and future candidates. So let's jump right into section 1, Jews, America, and the left.
Let's start right at the beginning with a pretty massive historical question that kicks off the whole interview. Why are Jewish Americans overwhelmingly aligned with the Democratic Party? You know, Ungar-Sargon notes that for decades, American Jews have by and large been a super solid voting bloc for the political left. But as she points out, this alignment is currently experiencing some really unprecedented tension. And it's prompting a lot of people across the country to ask why this demographic historically votes Democrat.
To answer that, her analysis suggests we've actually forgotten a big chunk of early American history. She argues that while many American Jews view themselves through the lens of an immigrant community with a deep history of oppression in the old country, their specific history here in the United States was uniquely different. According to her perspective, Jewish people weren't historically oppressed in early America, but were actually cherished as founding partners. She really believes that losing sight of this foundational history has profoundly skewed modern political identities.
And here's where that history crashes right into the present day. To really underscore the current political tension, the interview drops this huge statistic, claiming that 85% of Jewish Americans are Zionists. The analysis suggests that holding this position is becoming increasingly at odds with the modern political left, and that's creating a profound sense of political homelessness for a demographic that, frankly, has historically always voted Democrat.
All right, moving on to section 2, mainstreaming versus policing extremism.
Now we have to look at how the guest contrasts the way the political left and right handle anti-Semitism within their own ranks, because this is absolutely crucial to her argument. She posits that, sure, there are definitely anti-Semites on the extremes of both sides, but, she argues, the right actively polices and expels them from mainstream influence. In stark contrast, she claims the left currently mainstreams this extremism, suggesting that anti-Israel sentiment has basically become a mandatory price of entry just to be accepted in certain political circles.
Digging a little deeper into this cultural shift, the interview explores the hostility directed at Jewish people on college campuses. According to this framework, much of the anti-Jewish hate on the left isn't strictly about Israel policy. Actually, she frames it as an extension of a broader anti-right sentiment that's prevalent in modern academic spaces. She argues that Jewish Americans are essentially receiving the white treatment by frequently being categorized as oppressors within these modern campus ideologies.
Let's pivot to section 3, the influencer audience capture.
Because if that's the dynamic in politics, what exactly is happening in our digital media landscape? During the interview, the hosts and the guests discuss massive right-wing media figures, specifically naming huge commentators like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens. But despite their millions and millions of followers, the interview totally pushes back on the power of these figures, dismissing them as influencers without influence. The contention here is that despite having the loudest megaphones, they have absolutely zero real influence over Donald Trump's actual policies, or honestly, over everyday American voters.
So you gotta ask, if everyday Americans aren't the ones watching them, who is? In a really fascinating twist, the analysis suggests these massive metrics aren't coming from Americans at all. The premise is that the average American voter fundamentally rejects anti-Semitism. Instead, in a deeply ironic turn for America First commentators, she theorizes these massive view counts are actually coming from highly engaged foreign audiences and digital bots who are just desperately searching the internet for highly produced anti-Israel content. The core diagnosis here is a business model known as audience capture. Basically, these commentators see their metrics totally spike when they talk about certain topics, so they lean in, right? They convince themselves they're bravely speaking hard truths. But looking at the data, Ungar-Sargon concludes they're not even speaking to Americans anymore. Instead, they are completely captured by a foreign algorithm and the extreme demands of a global non-American viewership. It's a real game changer for how we understand online influence. Which brings us to section 4, foreign policy versus domestic reality. Let's see how this foreign focus builds into domestic economic realities, because obviously what happens overseas doesn't just happen in a vacuum. When discussing the youth vote, the analysis notes a super nuanced stance among young conservatives today. It suggests that, contrary to some of the popular narratives out there, they aren't actually anti-Israel. Actually, scratch that. It's more like they are strictly against all foreign aid across the board. And the root of this isn't bigotry. It's deep, deep economic frustration. They look at billions of dollars going overseas while they feel the basic hallmarks of the American dream, like just buying a starter home, are completely out of reach. Interestingly enough, the interview highlights that this pushback against foreign aid isn't just coming from young, frustrated Americans. Even many staunchly pro-Israel voices reportedly believe the current setup is flawed. The conversation notes that reportedly even Benjamin Netanyahu himself has suggested that Israel needs to wean itself off American aid. It's an acknowledgement that Israel has perhaps paid way too high a political and social cost for that ongoing financial support. This tension between foreign action and domestic reality is just incredibly stark when the conversation turns to Iran. While discussing Donald Trump's aggressive foreign policy strategies, the discussion really emphasizes the painful, immediate reality of $5 a gallon gas for the working class. The main point here is that while taking a really tough stance overseas might sound great in theory, the resulting spike in energy prices is literally devastating for Americans living paycheck to paycheck. The interview captures that economic desperation perfectly with this heartbreaking quote. It's an urgent call for political leaders across the spectrum to prioritize the immediate, desperate economic needs of hardworking Americans over these extended overseas entanglements. Because for voters struggling to just afford basic groceries and gas, complex foreign policy victories mean absolutely zero if they can't feed their families at the end of a long workday. And finally, Section 5, Midterms and Future Candidates. Let's unpack how all of these shifting allegiances, media dynamics, and economic frustrations will actually impact the ballot box. Looking ahead to the midterms, the interview reveals a super strong sense of optimism for Republican chances. And this is based on a few key factors: favorable redistricting maps across the country, a desperate hope for a drop in gas prices, and Ungar-Sargon's claim that the Democratic Party currently offers voters absolutely no tangible economic policies, relying basically entirely on Trump rage to motivate their base. When they start speculating on future vice presidential or presidential candidates, the conversation heavily contrasts two major figures, J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio. While both are well-liked by the hosts, they draw a really sharp distinction between Vance, who holds incredibly strong appeal with the core conservative base, and Rubio, who represents a completely different strategic advantage. And here is exactly why that distinction matters. Ungar-Sargon attributes this to Rubio possessing a unique crossover appeal with moderate Democrats in crucial swing states. Based on her own daily conversations with Democratic voters, she asserts that Rubio is viewed favorably by the center-left. And that's a demographic that is absolutely vital for actually winning a general election, as opposed to just surviving a primary. A fascinating strategic takeaway here is how these candidate choices might actually be made in the real world. The interview notes Donald Trump's totally unique tactic of testing crowd reactions to names like JD or Marco live at his rallies. By treating his audience as a real-time focus group, he gauges popularity directly. It's wild, but he potentially uses this method to handpick a candidate and completely avoid the damage and huge expense of messy, drawn-out political primaries. Which brings us to our final takeaway. We've seen how historical alliances are fracturing, how digital algorithms are creating foreign-captured influencers, and how the crushing weight of domestic economics is fundamentally changing the way voters view foreign policy. So the ultimate question we have to leave you with is this: how will this collision of influencer algorithms, foreign policy fatigue, and changing historical allegiances actually play out at the ballot box? Are voters going to prioritize their daily economic reality, their historical party lines, or something else entirely? That is the question that will define our next election cycle. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking great questions, and I'll catch you next time.